So my name is Marina Citrid, and I'm going to let each of us, of the presenters, Charlotte, Debbie, Emre, and I, will introduce ourselves a little bit. We are all, I don't want to speak for anyone actually, but kind of scholars and participants in different movements and groups. And today's discussion, we're going to focus, I'm going to more kind of introduce and facilitate here and kind of lay out a few ideas, but very briefly. And the bulk of our discussion is going to be Charlotte and Emre, who are both speaking about and from the perspective of Chiapas and the Zapatistas and the creation there, and Rojava and what's been happening there, what's being created. And Debbie's going to speak more about kind of theoretical approaches, particularly to what's been happening with the Kurdish communities and in Rojava with municipalism. But just as a moment of background, I mean, this is part of these two topics, the two areas that we're going to focus on are by far the most vast geographically and numerically. So we're talking about hundreds of thousands of people easily in the region, the Zapatista territories, and millions of people in the areas of Rojava. But it's part of what we're going to discuss is part of a phenomenon that is global, that has been happening in particular. This meeting, sorry, there's a question. This meeting is about prefigurative, horizontal, autonomous movements, and looking in particular at the Zapatistas and what's been happening in Rojava to that question. And in the discussion, we can talk about both these areas in particular, but also this phenomenon that's been happening in movements, in groups. Maybe people participating here have actually been a part of some of these spaces. And by spaces, I'm thinking about the movements of the squares, say the Occupy movements, or I spent time with the movements in Argentina, for example, after 2001, where people not only threw out their local governments one after the other, but formed massive horizontal assemblies, recuperated workplaces. So creating this idea of prefiguration is something that I think is going to come up, of trying to create the alternative that we envision. So they're kind of movements and groups. I'm talking about, I'm kind of giving an introduction as far as the question in the chat to the kinds of movements that are going to be discussed today here in this space. So movements that are prefigurative, movements that are more horizontal, so looking at power with one another, not over, not creating political parties, but making the change together and with a form of different kinds of forms of direct democracy. Obviously working within capitalism, because that's the world we're in, but at the same time pushing the boundaries of that, creating kind of alternative value systems that I think could be argued to be kind of inside outside, and all of them creating new subjectivities in this process, people changing in that. So the discussion part can talk about all of these different kinds of movements globally and these experiences, the theory, or very specifically about the Zapatistas, about municipalism, about Rojava. So it's kind of going to be an open discussion, we hope, following the presentations. But what we're going to do next is hear from, first we're going to hear from Charlotte, who's going to discuss the Zapatistas. Thank you, Charlotte.
Thank you, Marina, and welcome everybody. I'm going to try sharing my screen here, so bear with me for just a moment while I set that up. Let me know when you see something. You should just see one square.
No, I can't.
Do you see just the title page? Oh, great. Oh, you're over here. Okay.
Yes.
All right. Well, first of all, I just want to thank Marina and Emre and Debbie for coming on this adventure or this discussion of thinking together. Thank you to all the organizers of this conference. It's with deep gratitude and for the enormous hospitality and generosity of the Zapatista communities who have not only housed and fed so many of us during their events, but also consistently nourished and expanded our own horizons of the possible, that I humbly offer this initial theorization of what I'm calling Zapatista seed pedagogics. And just to introduce myself, Charlotte Science, I am speaking to you right now from the territory of Huichin, also known as Oakland, California, where I live part of the year, and I'm also a researcher at Ecosur, the Colegio de la Frontera Sur, in the state of Chiapas. So I spend my time between California and Chiapas. Here in the Bay Area, I teach interdisciplinary studies at the California Institute of Integral Studies. And so I am coming from the field of education, specifically through the pedagogies of social movements, with a decolonizing perspective to introduce to you today this frame of seed pedagogics as a way to understand the co-teaching and unlearning process that the Zapatistas have engaged in for over the past 3 decades, both within their territories as well as with the larger world outside of their communities. Now, this theorization is accompanying a parallel participatory action research project of about 40 interviews that I'm currently in the midst of. So I'm not going to be speaking about those so much, but more about the thinking that informs the research. And these interviews have been with adherents to the 6th declaration of the Selva Lacandona, and these participants are located around the world. So I'm going to parting from this Mayan notion, I'm going to explain what these are, what the 6th declaration is, and also this concept that I'm parting from, which is the Mayan notion of lequil huxlejal, which is roughly translated into this notion of a good life or a good existence. And Mariana Mora, in her book, Huxlejal Politics, expounds on this idea. So this presentation will introduce the concept of Zapatista seed pedagogics, defined as an ethical, political, educational process in co-construction of a collective political subject that is being built through dialogic and intercultural encounters between Zapatismo and the world outside their autonomous community. And here I just have a quote from a girl, a Zapatista girl named Defensa Zapatista. She tells Esperanza, that is our mission, to be a seed that seeks other seeds. I'm going to advance the slide, and this is where I've sometimes had trouble in the past advancing the slides, so let me know if it advanced. Yes, great, thank you. So Zapatista seed pedagogics are rooted ontologically and epistemically in the ancestral knowledge of their peoples and their territories, whose languages, in the case of Zapatismo, are the Maya, Tzeltal, Tzotzil, and Tojolabal. And in these languages, they structurally describe concepts and values of integrated relationship with the land or with the earth, its beings, its elements, and cosmos. Now, this notion of lequil huxlejal, which in Spanish could be translated to buen vivir, it exists in many native languages around the world, like Sumakasai in the Aymara, or Ubuntu from the Southern African Bantu, or Ukama from the Shona. It's a concept that points to what is necessary to live a just and dignified life. Now, it's an indigenous concept, the lequil huxlejal, to this context in Maya territory, but it becomes further politicized with Zapatismo and with Mora's articulation of huxlejal politics. You should now be seeing something that says the pedagogy of the seed. Emre, if every time you see a new slide, you could just give me a thumbs up, then I know. Thank you. Now, thinking of the pedagogy or a pedagogy of the seed, it seems a fitting way to reference and honor the legacy of Paulo Freire, the Brazilian educator, in the Zapatista movement, as as it very much draws upon his thinking and practice, in that it is a dialogical, reflexive, and liberatory educational process. It shares many similarities with other Mesoamerican and continental indigenous philosophies that were also nurtured politically by Marxist currents, critical pedagogies, and Latin American liberation theologies. In the case of the Zapatistas, particularly the Indian theology, they called it, of Samuel Ruiz Garcia, who was a Mexican Catholic priest and defender of the rights of indigenous peoples, and was Archbishop of Chiapas for 40 years, starting in 1959. He was also a mediating figure between the government and the EZLN during the dialogues. Let's see, so the seed part of this pedagogy is important, as it not only is the ground zero of resistance to the homogenizing process of GMO corn and the rise of an industrialized agriculture that threatens a whole way of living, not only as people of corn, as Mesoamerican people consider themselves, but also as people of the milpa, which is the integrated agricultural system of maize, beans, and squash. And so it embodies, to think about the pedagogy of the seed, embodies the territory in an ecological system that includes ancestral knowledges as well as the sacred. So, the philosopher Enrique Dussel distinguishes between pedagogy, which is the science and technique of transmitting knowledge, and this concept of pedagogic, which is a larger way of thinking of a part of philosophy that, together with ethics, politics, and economics, considers face-to-face relationships in geopolitical, cultural, and global contexts of inequity. For Dussel, a liberatory pedagogics requires listening to the voice of the other, to an otherness that is revealed through a slow, deep, and mutual listening. And it's an essential part of a praxis that allows the relationship to grow intersubjectively within this political ethics of equality. He calls it a liberatory education that is just, good, humane, and humanizing. For Dussel, a pedagogics of liberation is exercised by a procreative subject that generates prolificacy in the educational process, encouraging learning through a method of liberatory critique. It's a method that should not impose, but rather champion a collaborative, critical, and intersubjective creativity as the engine of a liberatory action. I find this notion of pedagogics paired with the potency of this native seed a very useful way to describe this ethical, political, educational process of construction that takes place through time, through different geographies, forming a collective, potentially revolutionary subject, both inside as well as outside of the autonomous Zapatista communities. Now, my current research is focusing on the exogenous collective subjectivity. So of all the many people and collectives and social movements who are drawn to the Zapatista movement. And so in this, I want to differentiate between the autonomous education that happens in Zapatista territories and this seed pedagogics that goes beyond the territory. Now, seed pedagogics developed from what is known as Zapatismo, and which encompasses a broader range of actors than the political military structure and the Zapatista civilian bases. Zapatismo today functions as an emancipatory, educational, and political ethical project. It is part of a centuries-long history of hemispheric indigenous resistance in response and related to multiple parallel histories of oppression and rebellion that Native peoples experience in their own territories, in this case, the Maya. Zapatismo as a revolutionary praxis is grounded in its own particular socio-historical and cultural matrix, which is constantly being resignified, collectively discussed, and reformed based on the struggle itself. And it's in conversation with other social movements, developing solidarity with other oppressed peoples around the world confronted with a similar historical domination of a capitalist, racist, colonial, and heteropatriarchal world system. Now, since their first public appearance, the early morning of January 1st, 1994, in the southeastern border state of Chiapas, Mexico, the Zapatista movement has grown and built itself in all sorts of very imaginative ways within its communities, its autonomous communities, but it's also been projecting itself outward towards a global audience. Now, in these 3 decades, Zapatismo has had an important influence and been in dialogue with numerous intellectuals, activists, peasants, artists, scientists, as well as other social movements around the world that, from their own local and regional circumstances, defend their land, their bodies, their territories, as well as life itself on the planet. So Zapatismo mirrors what Dussel describes as a pedagogics of liberation, and it brings together different philosophical, ethical, political, and economic meanings that get shared, discussed, reformulated throughout the many encuentros, the encounters, that have been held in Zapatista territory during these past 20, going on 27 years. Within Mexico, the Zapatistas work very closely with the National Indigenous Congress and its respective Indigenous Council of Government that brings together the indigenous voices and experiences of the country, and it is a long list of different peoples, but who are all in this Congress united in defense of their lands and territories as they face the state's growing capitalist frame of reference, even under the current administration of Andrés Manuel López Obrador. The CNI, the National Indigenous Congress, was constituted in October 12th of 1996, and it described itself as a space for reflection and solidarity with its own forms of organization, representation, and decision-making to strengthen the struggles of resistance and rebellion of the original peoples, nations, tribes of Mexico. Now, the Council of Indigenous Government is made up of 1 woman and 1 man from each language group of the various regions where the CNI are located. And it is governed by the 7 Zapatista principles. Do you see them now on the screen, the 7 principles? Okay, so these 7 Zapatista principles are also evolve out of ancestral knowledges that come from this alternative logic and are opposed to the capitalist colonial hegemony of thought that developed simultaneously, influenced by some of the principles also of the national liberation forces that then became the Zapatista Army of National Liberation. You see them here, and they guide all of the political functioning of the rotating councils of the Zapatistas, and they come under this general idea of mandar obedeciendo, which roughly translates into governing by obeying. It has agrarian roots at its core, which are around the rituals of planting, caring, and harvesting that are done in accordance to seasons, climate, and elements. And it is about a relationship with nature too, that you are governing by obeying nature. So it is both a social way of thinking about good governance, as well as a way of being in relationship with nature. And I can, go into that a little more detailed in the questions. But you see here, they are very much about thinking of oneself in relationship to the community. That it is not an individual or a collection of individuals, but rather the communal autonomy or collectively constructed identities that work together to form these societal structures, but also with nature in this relationship of governing by obeying.
5
They come
minutes.
from- Thank you. Oh my goodness. They come from a deep sense of comunalidad, which roughly translates into communality, but it is felt and understood as a political, ethical practice in relationship to other beings, plants, animals, mountains, rivers, everything. And these are forms of communality that persist even with the migration to urban centers like Mexico City, through informal economies and the failure of the state to provide basic sustenance. People rely on this sense of comunalidad. I'm going to go much quicker through these slides because I realize I'm running out of time. Here I just have a few points about the 6th declaration of the Selva Lacandona, which was a call to people around the world, to people of conscience, to build a new political culture and to join in a process of constructing a new way of doing politics. This is what led to these encuentros, where thousands of people have been brought to Zapatista territory through 38 massive events, or of many, many people, about 38 encuentros in these past 27 years, where people find themselves with many different other movements, other peoples, other ways, but they all share this anti-capitalist common ground. There have been many of them, but a notable one is the encounters of women that have brought together women to address some of the particular violences that are taking place both on national territory but also globally in the epidemic of femicides, and have laid this pattern of workshops and sharing of presentations and sharing of struggles, to then with the homework of going back to your communities and continuing to host and continuing to create encounters for women and other feminized bodies, including the earth, in their places where they come from. These encuentros very much enact this idea of everything for everyone and nothing for ourselves, enacting this power of collectivity and evidencing a deeply democratic political process that enacts the power of communality. So both in discourse and practice, the Zapatista movement has proved to be a critical and situated pedagogy, open to this process of learning and teaching with the whole world, its practice intertwined with the struggle itself. And it is now embarking on a inverted conquest to Europe, where the Zapatistas have literally, on May 2nd of this year, a delegation of 4 women, 2 men, and 1 trans person have set sail on the ship La Montaña to cross the Atlantic Ocean in a reverse, to continue this process of teaching and learning with the Europe from below. They are right now in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean and sending us communiques along the way. But their idea is to visit all 5 continents, and in this way grow this collective political subject from below at a time when we are really needing it more than ever, in the middle of the pandemic, responding to that global environmental and health crisis, seeking to share their knowledge, but also to learn and grow with the peoples of Europe. So my time is up. I am happy to answer any questions in the discussion period, and thank you so much.
Fantastic. Thank you, Charlotte. Next, we have Emre. You also have a PowerPoint, yeah? And you'll introduce yourself if you would. Thank you.
Hello everyone. I would also like to begin with thanking Marina, fellow panelists, Charlotte and Debbie, and everyone who's here, participants and organizers. Thank you for this opportunity. After a year's delay, finally we're able to be here. Let me see if I can share my screen. Can you see me? Oops. All right. Today I'll be talking a little on havalti, this concept of camaraderie, friendship, and I'm going to try to trace social transformation in Rojava with this in mind, but also I'll talk about a little bit of the research I did there on the ground, which is, not specifically on this topic per se, but very interrelated. And yeah, I'm gonna end with a few slides on my dissertation work. So a quick contextualization. This is the part of the world I'll be talking about. Areas in yellow are controlled currently by the autonomous administration of North and East Syria. For the past 7-8 years, there's been an autonomous self-governance experience in Rojava, Western Kurdistan, meaning West in Kurdish, and referring to Western Kurdistan, as many of you know. The context of Rojava, it was controlled by, the Ottoman Empire for centuries, and then with the nation-state ideas disseminating in the 20th century in the Middle East, and the formation of nation-states and republics in the post-colonial period, the colonization period, it experienced a lot of Arabization. The Arab Belt Project of the 70s, and this wasn't the experience. This was also the experience of Kurds in other parts of Kurdistan that are occupied by Turkey, Iraq, and Iran. In Rojava, things began. Kurds have been organizing, particularly the PKK has been organizing people since 1980 for 4 decades, but this organizing became more overground and visible after the Syrian Civil War, which broke out, in the near the end of the Arab Spring, and which sort of began a regional restructuring, of politically, diplomatically, socially. And here's I just wanted to share the preamble of the social contract of Rojava to just give an idea. As you can see, there's an emphasis on pluralism and coexistence. There's an open rejection of authoritarianism, militarism, centralism, and in intervention of religious authority in public affairs. So yeah, this is the charter in which the Rojava revolution has been growing. Havalti, Haval in Kurdish means friend, originally friend, but it's a word for friend that's not just, the social relationship of, having like a friend, but comrade. So simultaneously, like there are other words for friend that don't convey the comrade meaning, whereas Haval is the word, is one of the word, like is the one word for friend, which simultaneously has the comrade meaning. And this Havalti, like I was in Rojava for 6 weeks in the summer of 2019, and you could see every day in every space, in every interaction you have. And I would argue here that it helps, the more like it develops, the stronger it gets in society, the more like it becomes the main sort of social way of relating among people, and previous ways of relating socially and hierarchies sort of lose prominence. So the social camaraderie, this combination of friend and comrade, is born out of an experience of direct democracy, autonomy, and change. Here, I wanted to share the link to an article that actually Debbie and I and Marina had worked, and in it, I go into more detail about Havalti and social relations and transformation in the region. But just to give a sense, I would like to bring your attention to this section, and the the way Havalti, how is it different? How is it different than previous forms of relating socially? At its core, it's marked by decommodification of life and social relations. It takes basis, like its approach to conflict is very much constructive, open, and it grows actually from interacting with conflict. What am I trying to say? Let me give an example. I remember interviewing one of the higher top officials, and there was this conversation about, how the advancement of women's rights in the region and how things were changing. All these words exchanged. After the interview ends, there were these coffee cups that I reached over to get and take to the kitchen. And I was stopped as soon as the interview ended. I intended to do that, and I was stopped by the interviewee who said, what are you doing? There are women for that. So when I share this in other spaces with other comrades, there's an openness to this all. People openly discuss this. There is, and the main response, not the only response, of course, the main response is to talk about things openly, transparently, and with a focus of, using it as an opportunity for revolutionary change, as opposed to some sort of, divisive, sectarian conflict differentiation. Let me go back to the slide before we're getting too distracted. So there are a few factors, a few elements of the revolution that I'd like to highlight as what enables this expansion of Havalti. The way people, like more and more people in society, view each other as not just neighbors, not just fellow citizens, but comrades and friends. This like mixture of friend and comrade in the Kurdish word. And horizontalism and direct democracy is definitely one aspect of this. The more there are more than 4,000 local and regional assemblies at different levels, from the street level to the region level, and people have more access to decision making compared to both pre-revolution times and most other parts of the world, where predominant political systems are representative politics. The more people get involved, the more people have access to decision-making processes, the more this Havalti relation is strengthened, the more social solidarity is also strengthened through this. Autonomy is another key factor that enables the flourishing of these revolutionary new forms of social relations. The autonomy that the region has had not only from Syria but also Turkey, which has been extremely hostile, and in this hostile environment of war and embargo, the autonomy was predominantly maintained with the support of the US and European Union. Another important factor that contributes to this creation of a new society, I would say, is positive social change, progressive positive social change, and the area in which this is the most clear and most prominent is in terms of like gender dynamics, gender inequality. Women are organized in all aspects of life: social, political, economic organizing. Women are going to organize autonomously and through gender quotas, co-presidency system, autonomous organization. Uh, you know, uh, there's important strides that are being made in gender relations, and this also not only increases women's participation in social, political, economic life, but it enables the previous expansion of Havalti, the solidaristic revolutionary social bonds that I was describing. Class, yeah, another aspect that strengthens these revolutionary social relations is the transformation in class relations over the past 10 years. Even though the revolution has been the region has been operating capitalist background and environment of war and embargo, income inequalities haven't continue to exacerbate as it has in the rest of the world, and there's this conscious attempt to reduce class inequality. However, there are issues with that too. Like one main issue is there's still this big debate going back and forth about land distribution and or allocation, and yeah, in terms of the way people relate to their environment also improves the way people relate to one another and reinforces, strengthens those revolutionary social bonds that I was talking about. So yeah, those are some slides I wanted to share in talking about Havalti and the few factors that may be feeding it. Now I'm gonna try to sort of materialize and visualize my claims through this last part on economic mobilization and social transformation in the region, reflecting my field work. As you see here, these blue dots on the border area and a few here, Haseke, Teltemer, are the towns and cities I was able to visit in the summer of 2019. In these places, I spoke with Ministry of Economy officials and the autonomous women's version of these offices. I spoke in every city and town. There's a cooperative coordination center, and there are women's only autonomous versions of these women's coordination centers. I visited these in these cities, and of course cooperatives themselves and the autonomous women's cooperatives, and finally communes and women's commune. I mean, there's one women commune which I'm gonna share some footage about right now. Oh, sorry. Sorry, the footage is coming soon. Sorry, I mixed the slides. So my interviewees, about 40 of them were, commune members, co-op members, mostly between the ages of 30 and 50. And these are the types of collectives I was able to visit. Cooperatives on agriculture, husbandry, but different types of, industrial and otherwise cooperatives as well. And communes, the women's commune, the internationalist commune, environmentalist commune, and different neighborhood and village commune meetings I was able to attend. This is the video I was referring to. From Jinvar, the only women's commune in Rojava, the only women's village in Rojava, and one of the few in the world. As you saw, it's a oops, it's a big village of 25, 30 households. Oops. Sorry, the presentation is. Oh, my presentation just shut down. Sorry about that. There is a problem with. Can everyone? I cannot open my presentation. Sorry about this technical problem. I had a problem with my.
It's totally fine. I mean, that we're able to do this from all different parts of the world and share screens is just a marvel. So that there's a glitch is just, it's just fine.
Yeah, it says, okay, finally it's here. Slideshow. Let me, can everyone see? So yeah, the footage I just showed, it was from Jinvar, the only women's village in Rojava and one of the few in the world. 20, 30 households, all women members living and staying there. And you know, this Hevalti, I think it was the clearest, the strongest, like it was easiest to observe in my in the 2 days I spent there in my time at the village, where the camaraderie, the solidarity is to a degree that everything is designed and run collectively. People, you know, there are 10, 11 main activities in the village, you know, from making the food to growing produce to the bakery to the little school educating the children, and every of these activities are done in rotation. There's direct democracy where members come every 2 weeks in the academy building and discuss. Decisions are made all together in a long, usually gruesome, but very attentive, you know, like through a usually long, gruesome process, but for purposes of attentively addressing, you know, people's worries, needs. This is a photo from a cooperative coordination center. Like I said, there is one in every city, and they help fund cooperatives in that area. You know, jump starting costs they help, and they just collect like 5% of a cooperative's annual income in return to create this pool of cooperative, you know, resources to be given to, you know, future cooperative applicants, people trying to form their cooperatives. This is a
So, sorry, about 5 minutes.
5 minutes. All right, thank you. This is this is a photo showing a generator cooperative in Kamışlı. As you see, it says Rojava Cooperative, right, for the generator, but it also says Komuna Şehit Berjes, like Martyr Berjes commune, meaning this commune that is the basically neighborhood commune, which has its local assembly, makes decisions, decided to create this cooperative called Rojava of generators because of the, you know, wartime conditions, the irregularity of electricity. So the cooperative commune system also goes hand in hand. Like I said, there are more than 4,000 communes and local and regional assemblies across the region, where 4 to 5 million people live, and 200, 250 cooperatives that are working very closely together. This is a photo from Remaking, sort of capturing the two biggest economic activities in the region, agricultural production and oil drilling. This is a women's cooperative market that I was able to visit, and that. So let me say this comment at the end. These are some images from facilities, chicken raising co-ops, where again, I think this one was from Haseke, where 20 families like in rotation maintain and run the cooperative. This is another photo from Kobani, husbandry cooperative. I like to include this photo because it's a little, interesting, where a mother is feeding the calf and also getting help from another cow. And finally, this is from a greenhouse, like a women's cooperative greenhouse in Tirbesiye. So yeah, I was hoping that with these photos and the video, the presentation would be less boring, and sorry, I'm having issues again. Am I still sharing the screen? Sorry, stop share. Can everyone see me? Hello?
Yes, great. Is that,
Okay.
are you?
Sorry, I'm getting
Do you have
disconnected.
any last?
No, sorry. Yeah, that was the last slide, and I'd be happy to talk more in the Q&A section about detailed
Those
questions.
really help with both presentations. It's so great. So Debbie, maybe 10 minutes, something like that, so we can have the discussion. Fabulous. Thanks.
Great. Thank you. Thank you so much. First of all, thank you to my compañeros here, my fellow panelists who are also friends. And it's very lovely to be here this morning, and also to everybody who's participating by watching and hopefully engaging in the conversation that we'll be having soon. So I wanted to focus in a little bit on the specific sort of political ideology of Rojava and why I think it's important and tremendously important. And actually, after hearing Charlotte's beautiful presentation, there's such extraordinary similarities. So, between the Zapatista movement and what's happening in Rojava, and especially, for example, in the area of certain things like education, which some of us here don't even think that much about, as a political act, as a political gesture. So, as Emre said, and thanks, Emre, for the beautiful slides. It made me feel like I was back in Rojava. And I also love the slide that he showed of the social contract, because I think it's so tremendously important. If there's one thing I hope people will Google after this, it's the social contract of Rojava, because it's the document that, that people work very hard to prepare, and that really lays out in a very beautiful way what the principles are there. Commonly, they're kind of condensed into three, specific areas: feminism or women's rights, because Rojava is a very, very strong women's movement. It is truly foundational. It's something that you see when you're there, and it's something that has been articulated ideologically very extensively, including through the study of genealogy, which is sort of the women's own efforts to come to terms with their own history and really reinterpret the social sciences from a women's perspective. And the second part of that is social ecology. That's the second sort of principle that is foundational. And the third one, direct democracy. And these really, you see, these are very intentionally articulated in opposition to, to their counterparts that we see here: patriarchy as opposed to feminism, capitalism as opposed to a sort of ecological approach to how we not only steward nature but think about the economy, and the nation state, which is very consciously opposed in Rojava, and is seen very much as the enforcer of many of the evils that we deal with in the West, capitalism, colonialism, and also hierarchy. And so one of the things that I think is really important about democratic confederalism is that it is way more sophisticated, in a sense, in terms of its analysis than many Western analyses have been, that have really focused only on economic issues. I mean, in Rojava, there is really this sense that it's not enough just to have equal wages, say, if you could do that, or, for not only between men and women, but just say a more egalitarian wage structure. But we have to also really deal with the fact that nation states perpetuate this kind of command and obedience that keeps people from being free. And again, this sort of connected with what Charlotte was saying, which I found, really lovely too, in terms of the Zapatista articulation of a society that is free, a society where you live a good life. And so I think that those are very instrumental aspects of it, and that they can teach us a lot. Because really there's so many forms of oppression now, and we are starting to really understand that as we see this very more greater and greater articulation of intersectionality. So it's not enough just to have economic freedom. And so, all these important elements of Rojava's society are also very much that, for example, that Emre described with respect to cooperatives, because that is important, and it is a very communal society, but they're also very deeply embedded within a project of education. And again, I found these similarities with the Zapatista movement really lovely and striking, as Charlotte so beautifully articulated them. So education is really important. And one of the things, we often think of Rojava and we say, well, how did, there was the Syrian Civil War in 2011, and then all of a sudden in 2012, this vast area in the northeast of Syria suddenly became a kind of radical project of direct democracy and empowerment of women, and while they were fighting ISIS. But this didn't happen overnight. It happened as a result of extensive decades, really decades of education that went on first within the Kurdish movement in Turkey, and then later as Öcalan, Abdullah Öcalan, who is a Kurdish leader, came to Syria in 1979, there too, and lived there for 20 years, there too engaged with people, and very much often on a very, in fact, always on a face-to-face basis. And I think this is another important aspect of democratic confederalism and of this sort of direct democracy approach, which is, and again, also you see articulated in the Zapatista movement, which is this idea that people have to be able to talk to each other directly, to hear each other as neighbors, as friends, as fellow villagers, as people in cities and towns. We have to find ways of organizing ourselves so that we have forums. And as Emre said, in Rojava, some of these local councils begin in cities. It might be just one block that's a council. In villages, it might be half of a village. And that in each case, as part of democratic confederalism, the idea is that people talk, they discuss, they decide, and then they delegate somebody to take that view of the local community or the local block in some cases to the next level up, so that at each level you have people speaking on behalf not of themselves, not what we do where we elect people and send them to parliament or send them to Congress, but where they actually are representing the views of the community and are accountable to the community and are recallable by the community. This idea of direct democracy is so different from even just say electing progressives to office. And so I think it's very important and very helpful to have this idea of organizing and to start thinking even about what we can do in our communities here and how we can organize in a more horizontal way, in a way in which people are really heard and go through the process in a certain sense of reinventing politics itself. When we say the word politics, we tend to think of sort of a kind of a what my father, Murray Bookchin, would have called statecraft, which is, you know, it's something done far away. It's something where you elect somebody, you hope that they listen to, you know, the point of view that you share, but they're off doing their own things in some faraway place. And places like Chiapas and Rojava are completely reinventing this notion of politics. And I think that we're also seeing some of that beginning to happen within the municipalist movements that are springing up also around Europe and around the world, where people are saying it's not enough to just have progressive representatives or a politics where we're trying to make things better for people. Rather, we have to really re-engage people and really reinvent this idea of what it means to be a political creature, or to have a civic life, even that this idea of civic life can be separated from the state and from state politics. So the last thing that I want to say, and I really do want to leave time for people to ask questions, is that I just think that, you know, part of what we do in the left is often that we get very involved in our own local causes, because there is so much right now. There's, you know, the rise of fascism. There's just so many things going on. But I think it's really important for us to also keep an internationalist perspective. Just recently, you know, because both of these projects, Chiapas and Rojava, are so precious, they're so extraordinary at a time when there's really so few alternatives, you know, to look at that are developed in the ways these are. It's imperative upon all of us to, you know, to pressure wherever we can our governments, our colleagues, our friends to support these projects, because they provide such an important model. And just recently, as Emre briefly mentioned about Turkey sort of encroaching on Rojava. Well, this is getting worse and worse. As I'm sure you can imagine, the Turkish president Erdogan really sees Rojava's directly democratic society as a threat to him. And so there's been invasions, there's been, which I don't have time to go into the details of them, but most recently, for example, they've stopped the flow of the Euphrates River. Turkey has. They've blocked the dams, and just within the last, I think, 24 hours or so, it was announced that because of pressure by the Biden administration, Turkey is starting to now release the flow of water again. This is water that people depend on, 1 million people in one part of the region of Rojava, which is home to about 5 million altogether. So these kinds of things are very important. I think it's really imperative that we defend these projects and that we start to think about how we can, even in our own municipalities and our own towns, start putting some of these ideas into practice. Thank you so much. And apologies that I didn't introduce myself. I'm a longtime journalist and writer and former press secretary for Bernie Sanders. It was great to be here and look forward to our conversation.
Fabulous. Thank you. And thank you everyone for keeping time so we could have discussion. It's part of the democratic belief system that many of us hold. So I might need support from our tech person, but I think if people just raise their hand and make an intervention, and because we have 15 minutes, I'm going to ask people to be concise with your question or intervention so that we have as much time for everyone to speak who would like to. Right, or people can put questions in the chat. Thank you, Charlotte. Yeah, of course. Oh, there's a question. Okay, for both Rojava and Chiapas. Is there any industrial technological production happening in the present moment, or is there such development on the horizon? So for any of you,
Would you like to go first, Charlotte?
and if people, is that the same? Go ahead.
Regarding Rojava, yes, there is industrial production, but at a very small and limited scale, usually for like the absolute necessities, like car repair related or oil refinery related, oil being commonly found in the region and used in power maintenance. So there is limited small scale industrial production, but very much within the bounds of social ecology and with this heavy emphasis on environment and ecology in mind. One little example is that there was, when I was there 2 years ago, there was this discussion about having like a big car repair reassembly center, and it was gonna be built close to the city center, and there was this back and forth. First, the local assemblies made it happen so that the plan was going to be away from the city center, and later on it ended up being cancelled down the road. But yeah, there is small production, industrial production, but limited and very much ecologically driven.
Great. Charlotte, do you also maybe want to?
Sure. I think it's an interesting question because it raises the question of technology too, and there's certain assumptions I think in the question that we can bring to the question that have to be questioned. Just technology, the Zapatistas, of course, have used technology from the very beginning. In terms of producing the technology, I think we could say they also produce technology, including the remembering or the revitalizing of old technologies. So that is something to think about. I mean, what do we mean by technology? I mean, the milpa itself is a technology and thousands of years old, and that is something that they're very, very good at. They're also very good at using the internet and global communications as a way from the very beginning, from 1994. This was called the first internet revolution. And that has been something that has continued to this day in the way that they are using social media, and the way that they are using the internet, and the way that they are using the video production and creating their own media on with something called the tercios compas. They were trained to use these different technologies by different people from the outside, but then they said, bye, thanks, we get it. We have our cameras, we have our computers, and we know how to use them. So they're very skilled at using all these technologies and of producing other technologies. Similar to what Emre described in Rojava in terms, there are a lot of things around repair. So the repair of existing technologies like car mechanics and how to fix. The Zapatistas are excellent, not just the Zapatistas, but people in the region are very good at repairing machines, repairing cars, repairing, anything that needs to be repaired, water systems. So it's also like a way of thinking about, technology and industry that is a more sustainable way of interacting with these thoughts. So it's something to think about, decolonizing our ideas of industry and technology. What do we mean by that? And what do we already have? They speak a lot about using technology appropriately. Appropriate technology is a term that is used to fashion things like solar ovens, using very basic materials, and using the grills that so many local ovens are made of. So solar materials. Solar ovens are something that you see increasingly. Also toilets, compost toilets or dry toilets. Different ways of making use of minimal materials. So for maximum communal effort. But it's a great question that I'd love to go into further later.
Before, I'm going to read the next question too. Thank you, Charlotte. Even though we only have a few minutes, I should have said in the beginning, you can please ask your question in French or Spanish or Italian or Kurdish or Turkish. We'll kind of work this out, so language should not be a barrier. So especially about Rojava, I was wondering how the different religious institutions interact with the project.
I can talk a little bit about that. You know, one of the extraordinary things about Rojava is just how committed, I mean, it's not even a question of being committed, it's simply integral to the whole project. That this will be a non-sectarian, pluralistic society. And so even though people tend to think of Rojava as sort of a Kurdish region, in fact, it's a very largely Arab region, especially as the area has expanded as the Kurds and Arabs together in the Syrian Democratic Forces sort of pushed ISIS further and further away. A town like Raqqa is an Arab town. And so there's a very, very strong commitment in Rojava to making sure that everybody, that it's a fully inclusive society. You know, for example, I talked to a Christian woman who was well, she was a member of the city council, basically what we would call a city council here. And she said that, you know, that it was under Assad, it was terrible, that it was impossible to feel that you could practice your religion, that there was enormous repression. And instead now, really, they've gone sort of almost bending over backwards to make sure that people are represented. So represented from every religion. So for example, you know, as Emre said, I think that there are co-chairs. There's a woman and a man who co-chairs every level of administrative, whether it's a mayor of a city or, you know, an administrative office, everything is co-chaired. And often, for example, if it's a Kurdish man who is one of the co-chairs, it would be, say, a Yazidi woman or a Syrian Christian woman, or there. So there's been a lot of effort. That's obviously complete freedom of religion. There are mosques there, you know, there, unfortunately, because of ISIS and now because of Turkey's invasion, a lot of the Yazidi shrines have been destroyed, because Turkey's invasion has basically consisted of Turkey backing a bunch of Islamic militias to now go into Rojava. And it's a very odd situation where we in the United States and Canada and the West are supposedly supporting the Kurds in defeating ISIS, but now, on the same side, on the other hand, allowing a NATO partner, Turkey, to allow some of these very same ISIS militia back into the region. So it's a very complicated situation that really requires attention. But I would say just that there's enormous sense, just in the same way that women feel liberated to do and participate in every aspect of society, the economy, and where there are separate women's committees, in fact, for every aspect of society. Health, there's a women's health committee. Education, there's a women's education committee. So at every level of government, in the same way, I would say that there's extraordinary tolerance there that is truly a model for the rest of the Middle East.
Just to add on to that, just to add on to that, I was going to say there's also this interesting detail about religious communities, institutions, and their interaction with the new administration, because there's this myth perception that the Assad regime had for decades prior to the revolution. And the myth was that Syria was a religiously pluralistic society, state where different religious communities, minority religious communities are not prosecuted. So initially, at the onset of the revolution, I would say there was a little bit of hesitance, mainly because of the Islamic jihadists, massacring non-Sunnis nearby, but also this hesitance about the administration, I would say. Because of this, Assad regime propaganda that, you know, Syria never had a religious problem issue, and, you know, like, do you want to, you know, go back? Like, sorry, my thoughts are a little more scattered than I'd like them to be today. But initially, these religious communities had some distance because of the effects, legacy of this state propaganda, etc. But I think as time passed and these communities interacted with the revolutionary project and the administration, these concerns were less and less. After 10 years now, from the Armenians to the Assyrians, they all have, you know, all non-Sunni religious communities have their political bodies, military bodies, and are much more supportive of the revolutionary project compared to 2011.
So I'm going to read, thank you, the last few minutes. I'm going to read the questions because this is being recorded and it will be available to people and people can't see the chat. The first one that came in is about how do these revolutionary projects define the boundaries of the community, who decides who belongs to the body of individuals who participate in discussions, sexuality, consensus building, etc. One question. I would like to tack on my own, though I don't know that we have time for it, kind of alternative forms of adjudication. So when there's a conflict, how those are resolved. I don't know that there's time for that. And then the other one is a question about the different states and how they're affecting the Zapatista movement in Chiapas. So for example, the Mexican state and the US. And we should all be aware of time because we'll be shut off at in 3.5 minutes.
I'll try to answer all three questions really quickly. How does the state affect the Zapatistas in Mexico? Well, that is a big topic, but are not friendly. And there has been a huge increase under the current administration of aggressions towards the Zapatistas, attacks on their communities. But it's also been since '94 a ideological, a media war on the Zapatistas, discrediting the movement in so many ways. Also, the effects of the state are felt through the agricultural sector and in many complicated ways with these new programs such as Sembrando Vida of AMLO. There's a lot to say on that, but it's not it affects the Zapatistas quite a lot and quite negatively all throughout those years, but even in a very different way, but more pronounced in some ways now. As for the boundaries of the community and the question about religious institutions, you know, the Catholic Archdiocese of San Luis had a lot to do with the Zapatista uprising, and it's a fascinating process to learn about and consider. The Zapatista communities are not, are not religious in an outwardly way, but many of the Zapatistas are in fact Catholic and do practice a kind of spirituality that is very much based on the things that I talked about and in deep indigenous roots, but is in a syncretic way with Catholicism, and it is a very political spirituality. So that's just to say that. And then about the boundaries of the community, who decides who belongs or who participates in the consensus building in all the communal projects. Well, everybody participates in one way or another when they come of age, usually as young as 13 to 15, as health promoters, education promoters, or eventually to sit on the councils of good government, which make all the decisions. So everybody in the community, of course, that's within the Zapatista autonomous communities. And beyond that, to this larger frame of reference that we're calling Zapatismo, well, that would be a different discussion. But really, everybody in the community participates.
So can we go another minute, I guess? And we had just muchas gracias para compartir sus reflexiones y experiencias en el abrazo solidario desde Argentina. I know there's at least 2 people from Argentina listening and participating, which is quite exciting. Thank you. That's people thanking for sharing the experiences. Is there time for a quick, Debbie, Emre, on the kind of definition of boundaries, perhaps, in community?
I mean, I would say very similar to what Charlotte said, that in Rojava, there's very active efforts to include everybody, as many people as possible. And obviously in any political situation, not everybody wants to be involved, you know, but it's open to certainly everybody. The boundaries are geographic in the sense of where the Kurds have been able to take territory and sort of add to some of the existing territory they have specifically created youth committees. So young people are very active in every aspect. You know, there's youth committees on education and health, and they're really encouraged to have a voice. And that's also written into the social contract, that the youth will have a way of participating in the political structures. And also just to quickly mention what you said, what you asked Marina about adjudication, there's sort of alternative types of adjudication of conflicts that are very fascinating, that you could spend hours alone talking about. The Malajin houses, those are they're called the women's houses, are places where people from the community can come and discuss problems, and where basically a team of women help organize and bring resolution to those problems. Any problem that affects a woman can be whatever, say, rule or law or whatever that a local council makes concerning any aspect of women's lives can be overruled by the women's committee. So the women are very powerfully present in political life. And I don't know if you wanted to add anything, Imre, but just wanted to say those.
No, that was perfect. Exactly, space being the main determinant, and the community itself collectively deciding. And in the case of women-only spaces, you know, women's collectives deciding who can be part of the committee.
Well, I think we're going to say a collective thank you. We had a merci. There's different. Thank you to everyone participating. I want to make sure the next panel, I'm sure we all do, has time to do their check-in and prepare for the next moment, and all of you to take a break before your next discussion.
Such a joy.
Thank you, everyone.
Everyone, thank you. Thank you. Gracias. Merci. Okay. I think we individually leave is how people are saying thank you in the chat. It's too bad we won't get to capture that for the recording. There's lots of thank yous in lots of languages. Okay.
I just saved the chat, so you have that.
Thank you, Marina, for facilitating.
Of course, it's such a pleasure. All of you are just amazing. Compañeras, Havalji. Yeah, it's an honor. Okay. Bye, everyone.
Bye, everyone.